Tonight's archive file is different. This one isn't fiction. It's a real military training disaster. And it started with a decision that seemed routine. This story is based on documented real events, presented here in the D.S.I archival format. If you believe that military tragedies occur in combat, this case alters that assumption. There was no exchange of fire, no hostile engagement. 45 young soldiers did not return. I am reviewing the Antuco tragedy as an archival file, methodically and by the record. The documents contain a sequence that defies rational assessment, a chain of decisions leading directly into cold exposure, fog conditions, and total whiteout. The sequence begins routinely. Barracks, new conscripts, their families, a ceremonial day marking the issuance of weapons and the formal start of service. For the recruits, it represented pride. For the parents, relief combined with apprehension. Faces visibly young, expectations uniform. It is essential to state at the outset that these were not seasoned personnel. They were recent civilians entering military routine for the first time. Physiological adaptation had not yet occurred. Psychological conditioning remained incomplete. What followed was a field test that presents difficulty even for experienced units. The official designation was a training exercise, a forced march, ascent into mountainous terrain adjacent to the Antuco volcano. On paper, the operational plan appeared standard. Paper does not register temperature. Paper does not account for wind velocity. Paper does not experience cold. The first critical warning indicator was meteorological. In flat terrain, debate may continue regarding precipitation probability. In mountainous terrain, one variable becomes decisive: visibility. Once visibility is lost, orientation fails. At elevation, loss of direction leaves minimal margin for error. The files reference a regional phenomenon well known to local populations. White, wind. White storm, not a routine snowfall. Snow and air merge into a single field. The horizon line disappears. Ground and sky become indistinguishable. Personnel continue forward without recognizing deviation from route. At this stage, the matter ceased to be a training exercise. It became a matter of decision. A point frequently omitted in subsequent summaries must be addressed. The Antuco tragedy was not a singular accidental error. It was a sequence of minor decisions, each one subject to reversal. Interruption of any single element could have altered the outcome. Records indicate that risk warnings were issued. Preparations for the march proceeded. Personnel were deployed. Portions of issued equipment were not consistent with mountain conditions. A full accounting of names is not required at this stage. The primary issue is accountability. It was not abstract. Orders were issued by identifiable individuals. Decisions were made by identifiable individuals. The most significant factor was not the storm itself. The storm was foreseeable. This phase concludes at a point where reversal remained possible. The march was scheduled. The column was formed. Young soldiers stood in formation. Ahead lay an ascent where visibility could deteriorate within minutes. At that moment, according to the case file, a statement was made that effectively eliminated the possibility of a favorable outcome. The march will not be canceled. The march commenced despite clear indications of deteriorating weather conditions, not yet a catastrophe. However, warning signals were present. It is at such stages that operational errors typically occur. According to archival records, the column of recruits was led by Lieutenant Rodrigo Cofre Bravo, a young officer with limited field experience. This context is critical. He operated between directive authority from above and environmental conditions that were changing in real time. Initial conditions appeared manageable. Snowfall was moderate. Visibility remained acceptable. The soldiers advanced in formation, conversing and attempting humor. Such behavior is consistent with personnel who have not yet fully assessed the level of threat, particularly among new conscripts. In mountainous terrain, conditions shift rapidly. Wind intensity increased. Ambient temperature declined. What had initially appeared difficult but tolerable began to develop into a significant operational concern. The first indicators were basic. Personnel began falling out of pace. Packs increased in weight due to accumulated snow. Gloves became saturated. Once hands are wet, grip strength declines sharply. Control over weapons, straps, and equipment is reduced. Fine motor coordination deteriorates. Numbness follows. Testimony indicates that some soldiers proposed reducing speed at that stage. Several reportedly stated that visibility was degrading too quickly. However, halting movement under such exposure also presents risk. Wind removes body heat at a rate exceeding passive retention. At this point, the first decisive juncture emerged. Under standard safety assessment, available options included modification of route, reduction of march distance, or return to point of origin. The ascent continued. It is necessary to avoid personalization of fault at this stage. Military structures function through execution of orders. When a directive is issued, compliance follows. There is often an expectation that conditions will stabilize. Conditions did not stabilize. The white wind developed abruptly. The phenomenon is difficult to convey to personnel without mountain exposure. Visual field reduces to uniform white. Ground, sky, and horizon merge. Depth perception collapses. Directional reference is lost. Movement continues with minimal orientation. From this stage forward, command control over the march degraded significantly. The column began to elongate. Communication between segments weakened. Verbal commands required elevation of volume. Wind disperses sound rapidly. Cold exposure became the primary adversary. Not an opposing force, not a simulated threat. Physical law. The human body loses heat at a rate exceeding production through movement under such conditions. Witness accounts indicate early symptoms of hypothermia among certain recruits. Slowed reaction time, involuntary tremor, disorganized speech. These are critical indicators. The column, continued movement. The final entries in the archival record for this phase document loss of functional visibility and near total dominance of wind conditions over operational control. From that point forward, environmental factors cease to be the sole determining variable. Consequences of prior decisions assume primary effect. At a certain stage, the march ceased to function as a column. It became a collection of individuals attempting not to lose contact with one another. This transition occurs faster than commonly assumed. Several minutes of degraded visibility are sufficient for formation, integrity to deteriorate. One individual advances more rapidly. Another reduces pace. Another stumbles. Distance between personnel increases. Initially, the change appears manageable. Slight expansion of interval. Under white wind conditions, a separation of several meters is sufficient to eliminate visual contact. Survivor testimony indicates that commands were issued with decreasing frequency of response, not due to absence of orders. They were no longer audible. Wind displacement of sound is rapid. Personnel instinctively shift focus to individual movement and respiration. Physiological factors became decisive. Under cold stress, the human body conserves energy. Stride length shortens. Reaction time slows. Cognitive processing declines. This is not fear, it is a protective response. Within a moving formation, such response creates hazard. Individual soldiers began to fall behind. Initially one, then several. Protocol required that weakened personnel be accompanied. This occurred. Comrades remained with those losing strength. The column fragmented. Lieutenant Rodrigo Cofre Bravo, according to the record, attempted to preserve structural cohesion. This response was consistent with command training. Any officer understands that fragmentation of a column in mountainous terrain multiplies operational risk beyond that of an already difficult march. Environmental conditions were no longer subordinate to command intent. Orientation at a certain point became nearly impossible. White in all directions, white underfoot, white ahead. Terrain features indistinct. Movement could be upward, downward, or circular without recognition. At this stage, critical errors began to accumulate. Some individuals accelerated in an attempt to reach termination of the route more quickly. Others reduced pace due to physical limitation. Some halted briefly to regain breath. Under wind exposure, a minute of immobility carries significant consequence. Testimony indicates that speech among certain soldiers became disordered. This is an early indicator of advanced cooling. Instability of gait follows, then apathy. At that stage, the individual ceases active resistance to environmental stress. This phase presents maximum danger. It was during this interval that an event described in documentation in restrained language effectively marked the point of no return. Communication between separated groups was almost entirely lost. Position of forward elements was unknown. Position of rear elements was unknown. Direction of relative safety was unknown. From that moment forward, each minor miscalculation carried amplified cost. Subsequent rescuer accounts state that it was during this period that certain soldiers halted movement not due to fatigue. They had ceased to feel their lower extremities. Following the loss of contact between segments, the march ceased to function as an organized movement. What remained were isolated individuals, small clusters, and sustained wind exposure. By this stage, cold was no longer discomfort. It altered behavior, movement slowed, decision-making degraded. In some cases, an abnormal calm appeared. This is a critical indicator. Survivors later stated that the greatest difficult was not physical movement. The greatest difficult was continued cognitive engagement. Gradually, the mind disengages from situational awareness. Issued equipment contributed to vulnerability. Portions of the uniform were inadequate for mountain conditions. Gloves became saturated. Footwear absorbed moisture. When extremities are wet and exposed to low temperature, systemic heat loss accelerates rapidly. Initially, personnel continued active mutual support. Individuals assisted one another physically. They ensured that no one remained alone. This is a standard group. Response. As cold stress intensifies, focus narrows to individual survival parameters. This is not selfishness, it is biological preservation. Testimony indicates that during this interval, many began to fall, not abruptly, stumbling first, then sitting down for a brief rest. At this point, a critical hypothermia trap emerges. When an individual sits on snow under strong wind exposure, probability of renewed movement declines sharply. Some regained their footing and continued. In certain cases, movement was forced through deliberate effort. Strength reserves diminished progressively. According to the record, Lieutenant Rodrigo Cofre Bravo continued attempts to organize forward movement. He gathered personnel and issued directional guidance. Under near-zero visibility conditions, this functioned more as preservation of psychological cohesion than as effective situational control. Time became the dominant variable. Each minute under wind exposure reduced survivability. Each halt intensified cooling. Each additional separation increased hazard. Rescue personnel later assessed that even minor improvement in conditions could have prevented a portion of the fatalities. Conditions did not improve. Snowfall persisted. Wind velocity increased. Ambient temperature declined further. At this stage, according to testimony, certain soldiers began making decisions that cannot be classified as rational under standard operational criteria. Some attempted accelerated solo movement. Some ceased movement entirely. Some lost directional awareness completely. The event was no longer a march. It was physiological confrontation with cold exposure. At this point, the outcome became irreversible. Assistance remained distant. Communication was unstable. Physical reserves were depleted at a rate exceeding the arrival of rescue support. The most severe phase of this event did not occur during peak wind conditions. It occurred when the wind began to subside. At that stage, the extent of personnel loss became measurable. Once visibility improved, rescue units were able to operate effectively. Prior search efforts had been conducted with minimal visual reference. In mountainous terrain, this limitation is decisive. An individual may be located within 100 meters and remain unseen. Rescue personnel advanced with caution. The area that had previously contained an organized column now displayed fragmented tracks, points of halt, broken lines of movement. Personnel were located progressively. Some survived. Severe hypothermia was documented. Traumatic injuries were documented. Extended rehabilitation requirements were documented. For many, recovery was not possible. Cold exposure progresses without audible signal, without visible struggle. Strength diminishes incrementally. If intervention does not occur within critical time parameters, outcome becomes largely predictable. In the documentation, this phase is recorded in restrained administrative terms. numerical totals, time of discovery, medical determinations. Each total represents a young soldier, a family, individuals awaiting return from a routine training exercise. A separate review examined the chain of decisions preceding the event. Meteorological assessment, preparation standards, equipment adequacy, issued orders. In such cases, causation is rarely singular. It is typically cumulative. Lieutenant Rodrigo Cofre Bravo became a focal point of examination, a young officer positioned between superior directive authority and rapidly deteriorating environmental reality. The review process was prolonged and consequential for all parties involved. The principal conclusion extends beyond individual accountability. It concerns institutional structure, how decisions are established in advance, how forecast indicators may be discounted, how environmental forces remain indifferent to rank and planning. The event is now recognized as one of the most severe training-related disasters in the region. The memory of the deceased is formally preserved. For families, it remains a personal loss. For the armed forces, it constitutes a lesson obtained at significant cost. Review of the archival record yields a direct assessment. Catastrophe does not always begin when temperature declines. It begins when continuation is authorized, despite warning indicators.